It all started with boredom. Isn't that how all the worst stories start? I was in my final year of college, living off campus in a dingy little apartment with two other guys, Chris and Dave. We were all computer science majors, so naturally we spent most of our free time on our computers. One night, we were drinking beers, playing video games, and Chris brought up the dark web. You know, the part of the internet you're not supposed to go to. Curiosity got the better of us. We started off just browsing around. At first, it was mostly drugs and weird porn. Nothing too shocking, at least nothing we hadn't heard about before. Then we stumbled across a forum that was advertising an auction. But not just any auction. This was for people. We were all pretty buzzed and feeling invincible, so we decided to check it out. I figured it was probably just some elaborate prank. When we got to the site, it looked like something out of a horror movie. There were categories for everything you could imagine, and a lot of it I wish I could forget. Chris was the one who suggested we sign up for an account, just to see what was behind the login wall. I should have said no. I wish to God I had. But we did. We used a fake name, fake details, and paid for access using Bitcoin we pooled together. When the screen refreshed, we were staring at a live auction. The website was sleek, professional. It looked like an Amazon for human lives. We watched in stunned silence as the bids climbed higher and higher. The listings had descriptions, photos, even videos. There were categories for age, gender, skills. They had families up for sale, individuals, even children. Dave started clicking through the categories, laughing nervously at how fucked up it all was. Then he froze. His face went white, and he pointed at the screen without saying a word. There, on the list, was my name. I laughed it off at first. There are tons of guys with my name, right? But when we clicked the profile, my stomach dropped. It was me. The picture was from my Facebook profile, one I thought was private. The description included details that only someone close to me would know. I was listed under high demand with a starting bid of $50,000. My heart pounded in my chest as I scrolled down. And then I saw the rest of my family. My mom, my dad, my little sister. All listed, all up for sale. The descriptions were chillingly accurate. The worst part was the videos. Someone had been watching us, recording us. There was footage of my sister walking to school, my parents at the grocery store, even me in my apartment. I felt sick. I closed the laptop and threw up in the bathroom. Chris and Dave were freaking out, asking me what the hell we should do. I had no idea. We were in way over our heads. My first thought was to call the police. But what could I tell them? That I found myself on a dark web auction? They'd think I was insane. We decided to shut everything down and act like it never happened. I couldn't sleep that night. Every noise outside my window made me jump. I kept seeing those videos in my head, replaying over and over. The next morning, I called my parents. I tried to keep it casual, asking if anything weird had happened lately. They said no, everything was fine. But I could hear the worry in my mom's voice. I wanted to tell her, but I couldn't. What if I made things worse? I spent the next few days paranoid, constantly looking over my shoulder. Chris and Dave tried to get me to relax, saying it was probably just some sick joke. But I knew better. Someone was watching us, and they had plans for my family. A week later, things took a turn for the worse. I got a package in the mail. No return address, just my name written in neat black letters. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a flash drive. I plugged it into my laptop and found a single video file. The video started with grainy footage of my sister's room. She was sleeping, completely unaware. The camera moved silently, focusing on her face. Then it cut to my parents' room. They were asleep too. The camera hovered over them for what felt like an eternity before moving on. Finally, it showed me, sitting at my desk, typing away on my computer. The camera was right behind me, close enough to touch. I hadn't heard a thing. The video ended with a message. You belong to us now. I felt a cold sweat break out all over my body. I knew then that there was no escape. Someone was out there, watching our every move, and they weren't going to stop until they had us. I didn't know what to do. The police were out of the question. My friends were no help. I was trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. And the worst part? I knew this was only the beginning. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I left my apartment, I scanned the street for suspicious cars. I kept my curtains drawn, but even then, I couldn't escape the paranoia. My friends tried to help, but they didn't understand. They thought it was just some sick prank, and maybe they were right. But the fear was too real. Days turned into a blur of anxiety and sleepless nights. My grades started to slip, and I found it harder to focus on anything. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that video. My sister's peaceful face, my parents sleeping, and the camera right behind me. It was a constant reminder that someone was out there, waiting. One night, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I couldn't just sit around and wait for something to happen. I needed answers. I powered up my laptop and logged back into the dark website. The auction was still going, with new listings being added every day. I searched for my family's profiles, but they were gone. It was like they never existed. Panic set in. What if they had already been taken? I scrolled through the site, hoping to find something, anything that could help. That's when I stumbled upon a message board. It was filled with posts from people in similar situations. Desperate pleas for help. Stories of loved ones disappearing and cryptic warnings. One post stood out to me. It was from a user named Watcher, and it was addressed to me. Stop searching. You're making it worse. They know you're looking. My heart pounded in my chest. Who the hell was this Watcher? And how did they know about me? I clicked on their profile, but it was empty. No posts, no information, just the one message. I didn't know what to do. I needed help, but I couldn't trust anyone. Every time I thought about going to the police, I saw that message. You belong to us now. A few days later, I got another package. This one was larger and heavier. No return address, just my name, again written in those neat black letters. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a small box, wrapped in black paper. I tore it open and found a VHS tape. Who the hell uses VHS tapes anymore? I didn't have a VCR, but I remembered my parents still had one. I drove to their house, my heart racing the whole way. When I got there, everything seemed normal. My mom was in the kitchen, my dad watching TV. They were surprised to see me, but happy. I didn't tell them about the tape. I just asked if I could borrow the VCR. They agreed, and I went to my old room to set it up. I pushed the tape into the slot, and the screen flickered to life. At first, it was just static, but then the image cleared. It was my family's living room. The camera was hidden, probably in one of the vents. It showed my mom and dad sitting on the couch, talking. The audio was muffled, but I could make out some of their conversation. They were talking about me, about how worried they were. The scene changed, showing different rooms in the house. My sister's room, the kitchen, the backyard. The footage was recent, taken within the last few days. My blood ran cold. Someone had been in my parents' house, watching them, recording them. I fast-forwarded, my hands trembling. The tape ended with a close-up of my sister's face as she slept. The screen went black, and then a message appeared. We are close. I felt a surge of anger and fear. These people were playing with us, treating us like toys. I couldn't let them win. I had to protect my family. I called Chris and Dave, told them what happened. They agreed to help me, even though they were scared. We decided to set up our own cameras, to catch whoever was doing this. For the next few nights, we took shifts watching the footage. It was exhausting, but we had to do it. We had to catch them. On the third night, we saw something. A figure, dressed in black, moving through the backyard. They were careful, avoiding the cameras, but we got a glimpse. It was enough to know that this was real. Someone was out there watching us. We called the police, finally convinced we had enough evidence. They came, took our statements, and reviewed the footage. But they didn't find anything. No fingerprints, no clues. Just the same eerie feeling of being watched. They promised to keep an eye on the house, but I knew it wouldn't be enough. The next day, my sister went missing. She never made it to school. My parents were frantic, and I felt a crushing guilt. This was my fault. I had dragged them into this nightmare. The police searched, but they found nothing. No witnesses, no leads. It was like she had vanished into thin air. I went back to the dark web, desperate for answers. I messaged Watcher, begging for help. They responded almost immediately. Too late, she belongs to us now. I felt a rage like never before. These people had my sister, and they were taunting me. I vowed to find them, to bring her back. But deep down, I knew it was hopeless. They were always one step ahead, always watching. That night, I got another message. It was a video file titled Final Warning. I opened it. my heart in my throat. The video showed my sister, tied to a chair, blindfolded. She was crying, pleading for help. A masked figure stood behind her, holding a knife. The figure leaned in close to the camera and whispered, "Stay away, or she dies." The video cut off, and I was left staring at the screen, numb with fear. I knew then that I couldn't do this alone. I needed help, real help. But who could I trust? The police were useless, my friends were scared, I was out of options, out of time. I sat in the dark, the weight of the situation crushing me. My sister's life was in my hands, and I had no idea what to do. I had to think, had to find a way to outsmart them. But every move I made seemed to push them further away. I felt trapped, helpless, and more terrified than ever. And that was when I realized the true horror of it all. They didn't just want to take us. They wanted to break us, to watch us fall apart piece by piece. And they were doing a damn good job. After watching that video, I was a wreck. I couldn't think straight. My sister, my sweet, innocent sister, was in the hands of these monsters. I couldn't let them win, but I felt utterly powerless. The police didn't seem to take it seriously. I needed to do something, anything. I went back to my apartment and tried to piece together everything we knew. Chris and Dave were there, trying to help, but they were just as freaked out. We knew we had to act fast. We decided to take shifts watching the footage again, but this time we were looking for any clue that could lead us to these bastards. In the middle of the night, during my shift, I saw something on one of the cameras. It was a brief flash, just a shadow moving past, but it was enough to set my heart racing. I rewound the footage and watched it again, frame by frame. There it was, a figure, just barely visible, creeping through the backyard. They were dressed in black, blending into the night, but I could see they were carrying something. A bag. I woke Chris and Dave, showing them the footage. We decided to follow the trail. We armed ourselves with whatever we could find. Bats, knives, anything that might give us a fighting chance. We knew it was risky, but we didn't care. This was our only lead. We followed the path through the woods behind my parents' house, moving as quietly as we could. My heart pounded in my chest, adrenaline coursing through my veins. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, made me jump. We were close. I could feel it. Then we saw it. A small cabin, hidden deep in the woods. The windows were boarded up, and there was a heavy padlock on the door. We could see light flickering through the cracks, and we heard voices, muffled, but unmistakably human. My sister was in there. She had to be. We approached the cabin, trying to stay out of sight. I could hear my own breath, shallow and rapid. Chris and Dave were right behind me, just as scared but determined. We had to get her out. I motioned for them to cover the back while I approached the front. I took a deep breath and kicked the door with all my strength. It flew open, the padlock snapping off, and we burst inside. The scene was chaos. There were 3 people in the room, all dressed in black, and they looked just as shocked as we were. My sister was there, tied to a chair, her eyes wide with terror. We fought like hell. It was brutal, messy. They were armed, but so were we. I swung the bat, hitting one of them in the head. Dave tackled another, and Chris was wrestling with the third. It was a blur of movement, pain, and fear. I could hear my sister screaming, pleading for us to stop. Somehow we managed to subdue them. They were on the ground, unconscious or worse. I didn't care. All I cared about was my sister. I ran to her, cutting her bindings and pulling her into a tight hug. She was shaking, crying, but she was alive. We didn't stay to find out who they were or why they had done this. We just grabbed my sister and ran. Back through the woods, back to safety. When we got home, we called the police again, and this time they listened. They found the cabin, found the bodies. They started an investigation, but I knew it was far from over. For a while, things seemed to calm down. My sister was traumatized, but she was getting help. My parents were scared, but relieved. I tried to go back to normal, but normal didn't exist anymore. I kept watching my back, kept waiting for the next shoe to drop. Then, about a month later, I got another message. This time it was a text from an unknown number. It was a picture of my sister, taken through her bedroom window. She was sleeping, completely unaware. The caption was simple, "Round 2. I felt a wave of nausea. They weren't done with us. They were still out there, watching, waiting. I knew I had to end this, once and for all. I couldn't keep living in fear. Couldn't keep putting my family at risk. I decided to go back to the dark web to find Watcher again. They seemed to know more than they were letting on. I sent a message, begging for help, for information. This time, the response was immediate. Meet me, tomorrow, 2 a.m., the old factory on Elm Street. Come alone. I didn't tell anyone. I couldn't risk their safety. I grabbed a knife and headed out, my heart pounding. The old factory was abandoned, a relic of the town's industrial past. It was the perfect place for a trap, but I had no choice. I had to know what was going on. When I got there, it was dark and silent. I crept inside, every sense on high alert. I heard a noise, a soft rustling, and I turned to see a figure standing in the shadows. It was Watcher. They were wearing a mask, their identity hidden. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "Someone who wants this to end," they replied. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. These people are powerful, connected. They won't stop until they have you." "Why?" I asked, desperate. "Why us?" "Because you were easy targets. Because they could. But it's more than that. They have plans, big plans, and you're just a part of it." I felt a cold dread settle in. This was bigger than I had imagined. More dangerous. But I couldn't back down. Not now. "What do I do?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "You fight. You find them before they find you. And you pray it's enough." With that, Watcher disappeared into the night, leaving me alone in the dark, my mind racing with possibilities. I knew I had to act fast. The clock was ticking, and the stakes had never been higher. I drove home, my mind a whirlwind of fear and determination. I had to protect my family, no matter what. The hunt was on, and I wasn't going to stop until I ended this nightmare for good. The next morning, I knew what I had to do. I couldn't wait for these monsters to come for us again. I had to go on the offensive, but I couldn't do it alone. I needed help. Reluctantly, I told Chris and Dave everything. They were horrified, but agreed to stand by me. We were in this together, whether we liked it or not. We started by digging into the dark web again, this time with a purpose. We searched for any trace of the organization that had targeted my family. Hours turned into days, but we found nothing. Just dead ends and cryptic messages. Then, a breakthrough. Dave stumbled across a forum post by someone who claimed to have escaped from a similar situation. The post was old, buried under years of inactivity, but it was a lead. The poster, who went by Survivor, had left an email address. It was a long shot, but I reached out. To my surprise, I got a reply almost immediately. Survivor was cautious, asking for proof that I was legitimate. I sent them the videos, the messages. They agreed to meet. We arranged to meet in a public place, a diner on the edge of town. Chris and Dave came with me, all of us on edge. Survivor turned out to be a woman in her late 30s, her face lined with worry and fear. She introduced herself as Emily. Emily told us her story. She had been targeted by the same group years ago. They had taken her brother, tortured her family, much like what was happening to us. She had managed to escape, but she had been living in fear ever since. She had spent years trying to track them down, to stop them. But they were always one step ahead. "They're not just some random psychopaths," she said, her voice trembling. "They're part of something bigger. A network that spans the globe. They deal in human lives like it's nothing." She handed us a folder, filled with documents, photos, and notes. It was everything she had gathered over the years. It was a lot to take in, but it was the most substantial lead we had. Emily joined us in our hunt. She was determined to see this through, to finally put an end to it. We spent weeks going through the information she had collected. We found patterns, connections, and slowly we started to piece together a picture. The organization operated through layers of anonymity, using the dark web to conduct their business. They had contacts in law enforcement, in government. They were untouchable. But we were determined. We tracked down former victims, people who had managed to escape. Most were too scared to talk, but a few provided valuable information. We started to get a sense of how they operated, how they chose their targets. Then we got a break. One of the victims had managed to get the name of a contact, a man who acted as a middleman for the organization. His name was Marcus. He was our way in. We staked out Marcus's apartment, watching his every move. He was careful, but not careful enough. We followed him to a meeting, watched from a distance as he exchanged a briefcase with another man. We didn't know what was in it, but we knew it was important. That night, we broke into Marcus's apartment. It was risky, but we had no choice. We needed information, and we needed it fast. We found his laptop, hacked into it, and hit the jackpot. Emails, contacts, transaction records. It was all there. We discovered that Marcus was set to meet with the heads of the organization in 2 days. It was our chance to take them down. We copied everything, left the apartment, and started planning. We knew it was dangerous, that we were walking into the lion's den, but we had no other option. The day of the meeting arrived. We followed Marcus to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. It was the perfect place for a clandestine meeting. We parked a distance away and watched as he went inside. Emily stayed in the car, ready to call for help if things went south. Chris, Dave, and I snuck closer, trying to get a look inside. We could see them, Marcus and 3 others, standing around a table, talking. We couldn't hear what they were saying, but it didn't matter. We had enough evidence to take to the police. We started to back away when I felt a hand clamp down on my shoulder. I turned to see a man, dressed in black, glaring at me. "Going somewhere?" he growled. Before I could react, he hit me, hard. I stumbled back, and the world spun. Chris and Dave were fighting, but there were too many of them. We were surrounded. They dragged us inside the warehouse, throwing us to the ground in front of Marcus and the others. "Well, well," Marcus said, a smirk on his face. "Looks like we have some uninvited guests." I struggled to get up, but one of the men kicked me in the ribs, knocking the wind out of me. I gasped for breath, pain radiating through my body. Marcus knelt down next to me, his face inches from mine. "You really thought you could stop us?" he whispered. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." He stood up and nodded to one of his men. They grabbed Chris and Dave, dragging them to a back room. I heard their screams, the sickening sound of flesh hitting flesh. I tried to move, to help them, but I was too weak. "Leave him," Marcus said, his voice cold. "We have what we need." They left me there, lying on the cold, concrete floor, gasping for breath. I could hear Chris and Dave's screams echoing through the warehouse. I knew I had to do something, but I felt so helpless, so weak. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. It was hard to tell. Finally, the screaming stopped. They dragged Chris and Dave back out, their bodies battered and bruised. They were alive, but barely. Marcus leaned down again, his face twisted in a cruel smile. "This is just the beginning," he said. "You belong to us now." They left, disappearing into the night, leaving us broken and defeated. Emily found us, her face pale with fear. We limped back to the car, too exhausted to speak. We had failed. We went back to my apartment, nursing our wounds, trying to come up with a new plan. We couldn't give up. Not now. Not when we were so close. But I knew one thing for sure. We were in way over our heads. That night, I got another message, a video file. My heart sank as I opened it. It was my parents, tied to chairs, blindfolded. A voice I recognized as Marcus's whispered, "Round 3 begins now." After watching the video, a wave of hopelessness washed over me. My parents were in their hands now, and I was out of options. The fear gnawed at me, but I knew I couldn't let it consume me. I had to stay strong, for my family and for myself. Chris and Dave were barely holding on, their faces bruised and eyes hollow. Emily was there, her resolve hardening as she watched the same nightmare unfold for another family. We regrouped in my apartment, trying to devise a plan. There had to be a way to end this. Emily suggested we go to the police again, but I knew that was pointless. These people were too powerful, too well connected. We needed to take matters into our own hands. I remembered the files we had copied from Marcus's laptop. There had to be something in there we could use. We spent the next few hours combing through the data. Finally, we found a lead, a location for what seemed to be their main headquarters. It was an old abandoned factory on the outskirts of a nearby town. It was a long shot, but it was all we had. We armed ourselves with whatever we could find, knives, bats, anything that could give us an edge. We knew we were walking into a trap, but we had no choice. This was our last chance. The drive to the factory was tense, silence hanging heavy in the air. We parked a few blocks away and approached on foot, moving as quietly as we could. The factory loomed in the distance, a dark silhouette against the night sky. We split up, circling the building, looking for a way in. Chris found a side door, slightly ajar. We slipped inside, the darkness swallowing us. The place was a labyrinth of corridors and rooms, all filled with the stale stench of decay. We moved cautiously, every sound amplified in the oppressive silence. Finally, we heard voices, faint but unmistakable. We followed the sound, creeping through the shadows until we reached a large room. My heart sank. There they were, my parents, tied to chairs in the center of the room. Marcus and his men stood around them, laughing, talking casually, as if they weren't holding two innocent people hostage. I signaled to Chris, Dave, and Emily. We needed to create a distraction, something to draw them away from my parents. Emily nodded, and we split up again, each taking a different side of the room. Emily threw a rock, hitting a metal pipe with a loud clang. The sound echoed through the room, and Marcus's men turned, distracted. It was our chance. Chris and Dave rushed forward, attacking with everything they had. I ran to my parents, cutting their bindings as quickly as I could. The room erupted into chaos. Fists flew, bodies crashed into the ground. I managed to free my parents, and we started towards the exit. But Marcus saw us, his face twisted in anger, and he lunged at me, knocking me to the ground. The knife clattered out of my hand, skidding across the floor. "You're not going anywhere," he hissed, pressing a gun to my head. I felt a surge of panic, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Let them go," I begged. "This is between you and me." He laughed, a cold, chilling sound. "You still don't get it, do you? This isn't just about you. This is about control, power, and you dared to defy us." He pulled the trigger, and I braced myself for the end. But nothing happened. The gun jammed. In that split second, Chris tackled him, knocking the gun from his hand. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing the knife, and plunged it into Marcus's side. He gasped, eyes wide with shock, then crumpled to the ground. The rest of his men were either unconscious or had fled. We had done it. We had won. But the cost was high. Chris and Dave were injured, my parents were traumatized, and I felt like I had aged a decade. We called the police, this time with enough evidence to ensure they would take action. They arrived quickly, arresting the remaining men and securing the factory. It was over, or so we thought. As we sat in the hospital, getting our wounds treated, Emily pulled me aside. "This isn't the end," she said, her voice low. "There are more out there, more like Marcus. They won't stop, not until they get what they want." I knew she was right. This was just one battle in a much larger war. But for now, we were safe. My family was safe. And that was all that mattered. We returned home, trying to piece our lives back together. It wasn't easy. The nightmares, the paranoia, they stayed with us. But we were stronger now, more determined. We had faced the darkness and survived. As I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I knew this was far from over. The organization was still out there, still watching. But we were ready. We would fight. We would survive. Because we had to. There was no other choice. Okay, so I never thought I'd be writing something like this, but I need to get this off my chest. Maybe someone can help me, or at least tell me I'm not going completely insane. A little over a month ago, I did something incredibly stupid. I went on the dark web. It started as a joke. My friends and I were having a few drinks, scrolling through some creepy forums, and trying to freak each other out. We came across this thread about hiring hitmen, which was just crazy. We were laughing, making jokes about who we'd hire a hitman for. You know, stupid stuff. Then someone mentioned clowns. Not just any clowns, but killer clowns. We all laughed it off, but the idea stuck with me. I wish it hadn't. I don't know what possessed me to actually look into it later. Maybe it was the alcohol, or maybe just curiosity, but I ended up finding this site. It was deep in the bowels of the dark web, way past the usual crap. The site was almost comically sinister. Black background, red text, creepy images, but there it was. Hire a killer clown. It felt like a prank. Something ridiculous and over the top. There were reviews too, all written in this weird, almost childlike font. Stuff like, he got the job done, LOL, and scared the crap out of my neighbor, 10/10. I should have known it was too bizarre to be real, but the curiosity gnawed at me, and I figured, what's the harm in just looking? I filled out the form. It was all pretty basic at first. Name, address, target. I didn't put any real information. I'm not that stupid. I made up a fake target, some asshole boss character, and a burner email. I clicked submit and closed my laptop, thinking it was just a weird joke site that wouldn't go anywhere. A few days later, I got an email. It was from a sender named Mr. Jingles. I almost deleted it as spam, but curiosity got the better of me. It was short and to the point. Thank you for your request. Mr. Jingles will see you soon. I laughed it off, thinking it was some automated response. But then things started getting weird. I began noticing a clown around my neighborhood. At first, I thought it was just my imagination or some kid's birthday party. But it kept happening. I saw him in the distance when I took out the trash, standing under a streetlight, staring at my house. I spotted him in my rearview mirror, standing on the sidewalk as I drove to work. The final straw was when I found a balloon tied to my mailbox. It was a plain red balloon with a note attached. The note read, "Mr. Jingles is watching." My heart pounded in my chest. It wasn't funny anymore. I called the police, but what could I tell them? There's a clown stalking me. They thought it was a prank call. My friends thought it was hilarious, saying I was just paranoid. But then the messages started. They were on my car, on my front door, even slipped under my pillow at night. Notes that said, "You can't hide," and "Mr. Jingles is coming." One night, I heard noises outside my window. I peeked out and saw him. The clown was standing right there in my backyard, staring up at me with this grotesque smile. I could see the glint of a knife in his hand. I lost it. I ran downstairs, grabbed the biggest kitchen knife I could find, and stormed outside. But he was gone, just like that. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by my window, clutching the knife, waiting for him to come back. But he didn't. The next morning, I called in sick to work and stayed home, paranoid and jumpy. I knew I had to do something, so I decided to hire a private investigator. Maybe they could figure out who was behind this sick joke. The PI, a guy named Harris, seemed skeptical, but agreed to look into it. He took my laptop, checked the dark website, and said he'd be in touch. A week passed with no sign of the clown. I started to relax, thinking maybe it was over. Then Harris called me. His voice was tense. He said he needed to meet me in person, and it couldn't wait. We met at a coffee shop. Harris looked like he hadn't slept in days. He slid a folder across the table to me. Inside were photos, screenshots, and printed emails. He told me the site I visited was linked to a series of unsolved murders, all involving clowns. The reviews I read weren't jokes. They were real testimonials from satisfied clients. And Mr. Jingles wasn't just a clown. He was a serial killer for hire. Harris showed me photos of victims, their faces twisted in terror, painted with grotesque clown makeup post-mortem. He said the killer always left a balloon at the scene. My blood ran cold. I felt like I was going to be sick. Harris advised me to go to the police with this information, but I knew they wouldn't believe me. I had to find a way to stop this on my own. That's when the phone calls started. At first, it was just static and breathing. Then came the laughter, a high-pitched, maniacal cackle that chilled me to the bone. I changed my number, but it didn't help. The calls kept coming, and the clown kept appearing, always just out of reach. One night, as I sat in my living room, clutching the phone, I heard a noise from my daughter's room. I rushed upstairs and found her bed empty. My heart stopped. I ran through the house, calling her name, panic rising in my throat. Then I saw it, a red balloon tied to her door handle. I burst into her room, ready to fight off whatever nightmare awaited me. But she was just sitting on her bed, clutching her teddy bear, tears streaming down her face. "Daddy, the clown was here," she whispered. I held her close, trying to calm her down, but inside, I was a wreck. This wasn't just about me anymore. My family was in danger. The next day, I moved my family to a hotel, hoping to buy some time. I didn't know what to do. I was out of my depth, terrified and desperate. That night, I got another email from Mr. Jingles. "You can't run, you can't hide. I will find you." I stayed up all night, researching, trying to find a way to stop this monster. Every site, every forum pointed to the same thing. You don't survive an encounter with Mr. Jingles, but I had to try. For my family. This is where I need help. Has anyone else experienced anything like this? Is there any way to stop him? I can't go to the police. They won't believe me. And I can't keep living in fear, waiting for the next red balloon to show up. Please. If you know anything, if you can help in any way, let me know. My family's life depends on it. I didn't know where else to turn, so I decided to reach out to Harris again. When I called him, he sounded like he was in a worse state than when I last saw him. He agreed to meet me at a diner, a public place, where he thought we'd be safe. I left my family at the hotel, making sure to leave them with instructions to stay inside and keep the doors locked. When I got to the diner, Harris was already there, nursing a cup of coffee that looked like it had been sitting for hours. He looked gaunt, his eyes sunken and bloodshot. He didn't waste any time with pleasantries. I found something, he said, sliding another folder across the table. You need to see this. The folder contained more disturbing information than I could have imagined. Harris had dug deeper into the dark website and discovered a network of these killer clowns. Mr. Jingles wasn't working alone. There were others, each with their own twisted persona and method of killing. It was like some sick, underground club of psychopaths. One of the clowns, a particularly gruesome character named Giggles, was known for torturing his victims for days before finally killing them. Another, named Bobo, left a trail of bloody handprints wherever he went. The photos Harris showed me were horrific, bodies mutilated beyond recognition, faces painted in smeared clown makeup, and those damned red balloons. Harris said he found references to something called the Big Top. It seemed to be some kind of central hub or meeting place for these clowns. The details were vague, but it sounded like a mix between a hideout and a headquarters. If we could find it, maybe we could put a stop to this madness. I asked Harris why he was helping me, considering the danger involved. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and determination. My niece, he said quietly. She disappeared last year. The police found her body a month later, painted like a clown, and left in an abandoned warehouse. They never caught the guy. I think it was one of them, one of these clowns. That revelation hit me like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just about me anymore. Harris had a personal vendetta, and now I was caught up in it. We decided to team up, to find the Big Top and end this nightmare once and for all. Harris suggested we start by tracking down some of the locations mentioned in the dark web forums. We needed to find a lead. Anything that could point us in the direction of the Big Top. I agreed, even though the thought of confronting these killers terrified me. I had no choice. Our first stop was an old amusement park on the outskirts of town. It had been abandoned for years, left to decay and rot. The place had an eerie atmosphere, with rusted rides and overgrown weeds. It looked like the perfect hideout for a group of killer clowns. As we approached the entrance, I felt a chill run down my spine. The gate was hanging off its hinges, creaking in the wind. We stepped inside, the ground crunching under our feet. The air was thick with the smell of mold and decay. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound amplified in the silence. We made our way to the main attraction, a dilapidated funhouse. The paint was peeling and the windows were shattered. I hesitated at the entrance, the darkness inside seeming to pulse with malevolence. Harris took the lead, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. The interior was even worse. Broken mirrors, rotting wood, and the remnants of old carnival decorations littered the floor. As we moved deeper, we found evidence of recent activity, cigarette butts, empty beer cans, and graffiti on the walls. One message stood out: "Welcome to the Big Top." My heart raced. We were on the right track. But then, something caught my eye. In the corner of the room, partially hidden under a pile of debris, was a clown mask. It was grotesque, with a twisted smile and bloodstains around the mouth. I picked it up, a sense of dread washing over me. Harris looked at the mask, his face pale. "That's Giggles' mask," he said. "We need to get out of here, now." We turned to leave, but a sound stopped us in our tracks. Laughter. High-pitched, maniacal laughter echoing through the funhouse. My blood turned to ice. Harris and I exchanged a look of pure terror. We ran, stumbling over debris, the laughter following us, growing louder and more deranged. We burst out of the funhouse, not stopping until we were back at the entrance. My chest heaved, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. Harris looked around, his eyes wild. "We need to find the big top," he said, his voice shaking. "But we can't do it alone. We need help." I nodded, still trying to catch my breath. We had uncovered something far more sinister than I had ever imagined. These clowns were real, and they were dangerous. My family was still at risk, and now Harris and I were targets too. We had to find a way to stop them before it was too late. That night, we went back to the hotel. I checked on my wife and daughter, making sure they were safe. My wife could see the fear in my eyes, but I couldn't tell her the full truth. I just said we were dealing with something serious, and she needed to trust me. I stayed up late trying to piece together everything we had learned. The dark web, the killer clowns, the big top. It all felt like a nightmare, but it was all too real. As I sat there, staring at the wall, I made a promise to myself. I would do whatever it took to protect my family and stop these monsters. The next morning, Harris and I started planning our next move. We needed more information, and we needed backup. I reached out to a few friends, people I could trust, and told them part of the story. Some thought I was crazy, but a few agreed to help. We were going to find the big top, and we were going to put an end to Mr. Jingles and his twisted friends. But as I looked at my wife and daughter, sleeping peacefully, I couldn't shake the feeling that things were going to get a lot worse before they got better. We spent the next few days gathering information and resources. My friends, Mark and Jason, joined Harris and me. They were skeptical at first, but once I showed them the evidence Harris had collected, they were on board. It was a mix of curiosity and a sense of loyalty that drove them. They knew I wouldn't make something like this up. Our plan was simple, but dangerous. Infiltrate the suspected locations and gather enough evidence to find the big top. We hoped to discover something that would either lead us directly there, or at least give us more information on the clown's operations. The first location on our list was an abandoned warehouse downtown, rumored to be a meeting spot for Mr. Jingles and his crew. We arrived at the warehouse around midnight. It was a hulking structure, looming in the darkness like a tombstone. The air was heavy with a sense of foreboding. Mark and Jason carried baseball bats, while Harris and I had flashlights and crowbars. We approached the building cautiously, every sound amplified in the stillness of the night. The front door was padlocked, but Harris managed to pick it quickly. We slipped inside, the door creaking ominously as it closed behind us. The interior was a maze of rusted machinery and forgotten debris. The stench of mildew and decay was overpowering. We moved silently, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. As we explored deeper into the warehouse, we found signs of recent activity. Fresh footprints in the dust, discarded food wrappers, and more of those damned red balloons. My heart pounded in my chest as we pressed on. We reached a large open area that looked like it had been used as a makeshift meeting room. There were chairs arranged in a circle, a few lit candles, and a large clown poster on the wall with the words, "Join the fun," scrawled beneath it. Then we saw it. In the center of the circle was a table, and on it lay a horrific sight. A human mannequin dressed in clown attire, covered in blood. Its face was painted with a grotesque smile, and its eyes were gouged out. My stomach churned, and I had to fight the urge to vomit. Harris took photos, his hands shaking. Suddenly we heard a noise from the far end of the room. Footsteps. We froze, listening. The footsteps grew louder, and then we saw them. 3 clowns, their faces painted in twisted grins, emerging from the shadows. One of them, holding a knife, pointed at us and let out a deranged laugh. "Welcome, welcome," he cackled. "Mr. Jingles said we might have some visitors tonight." Panic set in. We were outnumbered and outgunned. The clowns moved closer, their laughter echoing in the cavernous space. Harris swung his flashlight, trying to blind them, but it only seemed to amuse them more. Mark and Jason raised their bats, ready to defend themselves, but I could see the fear in their eyes. In a desperate move, I grabbed a chair and hurled it at the nearest clown. It struck him in the chest, knocking him off balance. Harris shouted for us to run, and we bolted for the exit. The clowns gave chase, their laughter turning into enraged screams. We raced through the dark corridors, stumbling over debris, hearts pounding. We burst out of the warehouse and into the cold night air. We didn't stop running until we reached the safety of our cars. Breathless and terrified, we looked back to see the clowns standing at the entrance, their faces illuminated by the moonlight, still grinning, still laughing. We regrouped at a nearby diner, trying to process what had just happened. Mark and Jason were visibly shaken, but they were determined to see this through. Harris spread out the photos on the table, pointing out the clues we had gathered. There was something about the layout of the warehouse, the arrangement of the meeting room, and the symbols we had seen that hinted at a larger plan. Harris had noticed a recurring motif in the graffiti and symbols, a pattern that looked like a map. We traced it out, realizing it led to an old carnival ground on the outskirts of the city. The carnival had been shut down years ago after a series of mysterious accidents and disappearances. It was the perfect place for the big top. The next night, we set out for the carnival. This time, we were better prepared. We brought more weapons, flashlights, and even a couple of handguns that Jason managed to procure. We knew this was it, our best chance to put an end to the nightmare that had taken over our lives. The carnival was a desolate wasteland of rusted rides and decaying tents. The wind whistled through the empty booths, creating an eerie symphony of creaks and groans. As we made our way through the grounds, we saw more signs of the clown's balloons tied to posts, clown makeup smeared on mirrors, and the ever-present laughter that seemed to follow us wherever we went. We reached the heart of the carnival, where the main tent stood. It was larger than the others, towering above us like a grotesque cathedral. The entrance was flanked by 2 clown statues, their faces frozen in sinister smiles. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for whatever horrors lay inside. We entered the tent, our flashlights illuminating the dark interior. The air was thick with the scent of blood and decay. In the center of the tent was a large ring, like a circus arena, surrounded by rows of empty seats. Hanging from the rafters were dozens of red balloons, swaying gently in the breeze. And then we saw him, Mr. Jingles himself, standing in the center of the ring, his painted face twisted into a grotesque grin. He held a knife in one hand and a red balloon in the other. Around him were more clowns, their eyes gleaming with malevolent glee. "Welcome to the big top," Mr. Jingles announced, his voice dripping with malice. "I've been expecting you." The clowns began to close in on us, their laughter growing louder and more manic. Harris raised his gun, aiming it at Mr. Jingles. "It ends here," he shouted. Mr. Jingles just laughed. "Oh, it's only just begun." The next few moments were a blur of chaos and violence. Shots were fired, screams echoed through the tent, and the clowns descended upon us with a ferocity I had never seen before. Harris and I fought back, swinging our weapons, trying to keep the clowns at bay. Mark and Jason did the same, their faces masks of determination and fear. In the midst of the struggle, I caught sight of something that made my blood run cold. In the back of the tent was a cage, and inside, it was my daughter, tied up and gagged, her eyes wide with terror. Rage and fear surged through me. I fought my way toward her, determined to save her at any cost. As I reached the cage, a clown grabbed me from behind, pulling me away. I struggled, but his grip was like iron. I saw Mr. Jingles approaching, his knife glinting in the dim light. "Say goodbye," he sneered, raising the knife. But then, a shot rang out. Mr. Jingles staggered, clutching his side. Harris had shot him. The clown holding me loosened his grip, and I broke free, rushing to the cage. I managed to get it open, pulling my daughter into my arms. She was crying, but she was alive. Harris, Mark, and Jason continued to fight off the clowns, pushing them back. Mr. Jingles, wounded but not defeated, snarled in rage. "This isn't over," he hissed. We didn't wait to find out what he meant. We grabbed what we could and ran, dragging my daughter with us. We didn't stop until we were far away from the carnival, the sounds of laughter and screams fading into the distance. Back at the hotel, we tended to our wounds and tried to come up with a new plan. We had found the big top, but we hadn't ended the threat. Mr. Jingles was still out there, and he wouldn't stop until he had his revenge. As I held my daughter close, I knew we were in for the fight of our lives. We had to stop Mr. Jingles and his twisted circus, no matter the cost. Our nightmare was far from over, but we were ready to face it head on. For my family, for Harris's niece, and for all the victims of the killer clowns, we would see this through to the end. We spent the next few days recovering and strategizing. The attack at the carnival had left us shaken, but it also gave us something invaluable: hope. We had found the big top and confronted Mr. Jingles. He was hurt, and that meant he could be defeated. Harris, Mark, Jason, and I met in my hotel room, which had become our makeshift headquarters. My wife took our daughter to stay with her parents in another state. I hated to send them away, but I knew it was the only way to keep them safe. My wife understood, but the fear in her eyes as she kissed me goodbye was hard to bear. We pored over the photos and notes Harris had taken. The carnival had been a death trap, but it also held clues. We discovered symbols etched into the walls of the tent, a combination of old carnival iconography and something more sinister, almost cult-like. Harris believed these symbols were part of a larger network of locations tied to the Big Top. Our next target was an abandoned theater downtown. It had been closed for years after a series of unexplained accidents. Harris had found references to it in the dark web forums, suggesting it was another meeting place for the clowns. This time, we were better prepared. We wore body armor, carried more weapons, and had a solid plan. We arrived at the theater just before midnight. The place was a crumbling relic, its facade covered in grime and graffiti. The marquee, long broken, still bore the faded name of its last show, the greatest show on Earth. The irony wasn't lost on us. We split into pairs. Harris and Jason took the ground floor, while Mark and I headed upstairs. The interior was just as decrepit as the outside. The air was thick with dust and decay, and the floorboards creaked ominously under our weight. The seats were ripped and covered in mold. The stage was littered with debris, and the walls were adorned with more of those damned clown posters. As Mark and I crept through the upper levels, we heard faint laughter echoing from below. We exchanged a glance, both of us gripping our weapons tighter. We moved cautiously, checking each room. Most were empty, but then we found a door marked "Employees Only." It was locked, but Mark managed to force it open. Inside, we found a small office filled with old playbills and theater props. But what caught our attention was the large map pinned to the wall. It was a map of the city, covered in red pins. Each pin marked a location tied to the clowns' abandoned buildings, warehouses, even some residential addresses. At the center was a large red X marked "Final Act." As we studied the map, the laughter grew louder. I motioned for Mark to stay quiet, and we continued our search. We moved to the balcony overlooking the main theater. Below, we saw Harris and Jason in a standoff with several clowns. Mr. Jingles was there too, his side bandaged, but his grin as menacing as ever. Harris and Jason were outnumbered, but they fought fiercely. The clowns were relentless, attacking with knives and clubs. We had to act fast. I signaled to Mark, and we took aim, firing at the clowns from above. The surprise attack gave Harris and Jason the opening they needed. They fought their way to the stage, driving the clowns back. Mr. Jingles, however, didn't retreat. He stood his ground, his eyes locked on us. "You think you can stop us?" he taunted. "This is just the beginning. The Big Top will rise again, and we will spread chaos like never before." I felt a surge of rage. This monster had terrorized my family, killed Harris's niece, and countless others. I wasn't going to let him get away. I charged down the stairs, Mark right behind me. We joined Harris and Jason on the stage, surrounding Mr. Jingles. He laughed, a high-pitched, insane cackle that sent chills down my spine. "You're too late," he said. "The final act is already in motion." Before we could react, he threw a smoke bomb at our feet. The theater filled with thick, choking smoke. We coughed and stumbled, trying to find our way out. When the smoke cleared, Mr. Jingles and his clowns were gone. We regrouped outside, gasping for air. Harris was furious. "We had him!" he shouted, slamming his fist against the wall. "We were so close." I put a hand on his shoulder. "We have the map," I said. "We know where they're planning their final act. We can still stop them." The map led us to an old circus train yard on the outskirts of the city. The place had been abandoned for decades, the tracks rusted and overgrown with weeds. The train cars, once vibrant and colorful, were now faded and covered in grime. We arrived just before dawn, hoping to catch the clowns off guard. The air was thick with tension as we moved through the train yard, our flashlights cutting through the pre-dawn gloom. We reached a large central car that seemed to be the hub of activity. Peering through the windows, we saw clowns bustling about, setting up what looked like a stage. Mr. Jingles stood at the center, directing them. The atmosphere was charged with a sense of anticipation, like they were preparing for a grand performance. We devised a plan to divide and conquer. Harris and Jason would create a distraction, drawing the clowns away from the main car, while Mark and I snuck inside to confront Mr. Jingles. It was risky, but we had no other choice. Harris and Jason set off a series of firecrackers at the far end of the yard, drawing the clowns' attention. As they moved to investigate, Mark and I slipped inside the car. It was dark and cramped, filled with old circus equipment and props. We moved silently, our footsteps barely making a sound. We found Mr. Jingles in a small compartment at the back, surrounded by maps and plans. He was alone, muttering to himself, his back turned to us. I took a deep breath, then stepped forward, my gun trained on him. "It's over, Jingles," I said, my voice steady despite the fear coursing through me. "Turn around, slowly." He froze, then slowly turned to face us. His eyes gleamed with a mix of madness and amusement. "You're too late," he said, a sinister smile creeping across his face. "The final act is already in motion, and when it's done, there will be nothing left but chaos." I tightened my grip on the gun. "We'll see about that." But before I could react, he lunged at me, knocking the gun from my hand. We grappled, the confined space making it difficult to move. He was surprisingly strong, his hands clawing at my throat. I struggled, trying to break free, but his grip was like iron. Mark rushed to help, but one of the clowns burst into the car, attacking him. They fought fiercely, trading blows. I managed to get a hand free and grabbed a nearby piece of broken glass, slashing at Mr. Jingles. He screamed in pain, loosening his grip just enough for me to push him away. I grabbed the gun from the floor and fired, the shot echoing through the car. Mr. Jingles staggered, blood spreading across his chest. He looked at me, a mixture of rage and disbelief in his eyes. "This isn't over," he gasped, before collapsing to the ground. The remaining clowns, hearing the gunshot, fled the train yard, their laughter echoing in the distance. Harris and Jason joined us, their faces grim but determined. We had stopped Mr. Jingles, but we knew it wasn't the end. We destroyed the plans and maps, ensuring the clowns couldn't carry out their final act. We contacted the authorities, providing them with the evidence we had gathered. It took weeks of investigations and interrogations, but eventually, the network of killer clowns was dismantled. My family returned home, and for the first time in months, we felt a semblance of peace. Harris found some closure, knowing he had avenged his niece. Mark and Jason tried to return to their normal lives, though the scars of our ordeal would never fully heal. As for me, I still see red balloons in my nightmares. The laughter haunts me, a constant reminder of the horrors we faced. But I know we did the right thing. We stopped the clowns, and we saved countless lives. But even now, as I sit here writing this, I can't shake the feeling that somewhere out there, in the shadows, another Mr. Jingles is waiting. And if he comes back, I'll be ready. Months have passed since we dismantled the Big Top, but life hasn't returned to normal. The nightmares persist, and the fear lingers like a shadow, always lurking at the edges of my mind. My wife and daughter have settled back into their routine, but I can see the tension in their eyes, the way they jump at sudden noises. It's a constant reminder that the horror we faced wasn't just a nightmare, it was real. One night, I was sitting in my living room, flipping through channels aimlessly, trying to distract myself. My wife and daughter were asleep upstairs. The house was quiet, but the silence felt heavy, oppressive. I decided to check my email, hoping for something, anything, to take my mind off the lingering dread. That's when I saw it. An email from an unknown sender with the subject line, "See you soon." My heart skipped a beat. I hesitated, then clicked it open. The email was short and to the point. "You can't stop the Big Top. We're always watching. See you soon." My hands trembled as I read the words. I knew it wasn't over. I had to do something, but what? I couldn't involve my family again. They had been through enough. I needed to confront this head on, alone if necessary. I called Harris and told him about the email. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "We need to meet. There's something you need to see." He sounded serious, more so than usual. We agreed to meet at his office the next morning. The following day, I arrived at Harris's office early. He greeted me with a grim expression, leading me to a back room filled with files and photos. On the table was a large folder labeled Big Top. "I've been doing some digging," Harris said, opening the folder. "Even after we took down Mr. Jingles, there have been reports of clown sightings, attacks, all over the country. It's like they're rebuilding, gathering strength." He showed me photos of recent victims, each one more gruesome than the last. The patterns were the same: clown makeup, red balloons, and the same sinister laughter described by witnesses. Harris pointed to a map on the wall, marked with red pins indicating the new attacks. "They're moving," he said. "It's like they're following a route, heading towards something." I felt a cold dread settle in my stomach. What's their destination? Harris shook his head. I don't know yet, but we need to find out. If we can predict their next move, maybe we can stop them for good. We spent the next few days poring over the data, trying to decipher the clown's pattern. It was like piecing together a twisted puzzle, each clue more disturbing than the last. Finally, we noticed a pattern. The attacks were following old circus routes, leading towards a remote, abandoned fairground on the outskirts of the state. We decided to take action before it was too late. Mark and Jason joined us again, despite their reservations. They understood the stakes. We gathered our gear, preparing for what felt like a final showdown. This time, we were ready to end it, once and for all. We arrived at the fairground at dusk. The place was a decaying nightmare, a twisted parody of childhood memories. Rusted rides, tattered banners, and broken lights created an atmosphere of forgotten joy turned sinister. The entrance was marked by a faded sign, "Welcome to the greatest show on earth." We moved cautiously, sticking together, our flashlights cutting through the growing darkness. The fairground was eerily silent, the only sound being the crunch of our footsteps on the gravel. As we approached the central area, we saw them. Dozens of clowns gathered around a large bonfire, performing some kind of ritual. Mr. Jingles was there, his wounds bandaged, but his malevolent presence undiminished. He stood at the center, leading the ritual, his voice carrying a chant that sent shivers down my spine. Around him, the clowns danced and laughed, their faces illuminated by the flickering firelight. Harris nodded, and we moved into position. We had a plan to divide and conquer, just like before. This time, we had more firepower, more determination. We knew what we were up against. The signal was given, and we attacked. Harris and Jason opened fire from one side, while Mark and I flanked them from the other. Chaos erupted as the clowns scattered, their laughter turning to screams of rage and pain. Mr. Jingles tried to rally them, but we pressed our advantage, pushing them back. The battle was intense, brutal. The clowns fought with a ferocity born of madness, but we were relentless. I found myself face to face with Mr. Jingles, his eyes burning with hatred. He lunged at me, but I was ready. We grappled, trading blows, the world narrowing to just the two of us. "You can't stop us," he snarled. "The big top will rise again." I gritted my teeth, driving my knee into his gut, knocking the wind out of him. "Not this time," I said, raising my weapon. "This ends now." With a final desperate effort, I fired. The shot rang out, and Mr. Jingles fell, his twisted smile finally fading. The remaining clowns, seeing their leader fall, broke and ran, disappearing into the night. We stood there, panting, the adrenaline slowly ebbing away. The fire crackled, casting eerie shadows on the fairground. It was over. We had stopped the big top, for now. In the days that followed, the authorities moved in, dismantling the fairground and hunting down the remaining clowns. The network was broken, their power diminished. My family and I tried to pick up the pieces of our lives, hoping for some semblance of normalcy. But even now, as I sit here writing this, I can't shake the feeling that somewhere out there, the laughter is still echoing. The red balloons, the painted smiles, the darkness that lurks just out of sight. We may have won this battle, but the war against the nightmares that haunt us is far from over. If you see a red balloon, if you hear the distant echo of laughter, remember this story. Stay vigilant, because you never know when the big top might rise again.